Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Glidden, and I am the Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives for the Minnesota Housing Partnership. And we are ready to start our webinar on Introduction to Local Housing Trust Funds. Just so that you know, you're in the right place at the right time. Our Local Housing Trust Fund webinar is a companion to the recent release of Minnesota Housing Partnership's Local Housing Trust Fund Manual for the state of Minnesota, which you can find. We're going to send you a link so you can know how to find it, but it's online at our website. And our webinar, this is the first in a short series of webinars which will combine information from the Local Housing Trust Fund Manual with local perspectives and practice tips. For today, I will be presenting along with Casey Lauderdale, an officer for community development at Minnesota Housing Partnership and the primary author of the Manual for Local Housing Trust Funds, along with guest speakers, Kayla Schuchman from the City of Saint Paul, where she is the housing director, and Jeff Hess, the executive director for the City of Alexandria Housing and Redevelopment Authority. For today, we will be presenting some information using PowerPoints to guide our conversation. And then we are going to open for questions so that we can have some dialogue about how to initiate a local housing trust fund and what might be some of the decisions that you might consider when determining whether to move forward with this initiative. We will be utilizing the question and answer function for the webinar. And so as you think of questions, go ahead and submit them, and we will be able to see them and then forward them to the speakers. And we will continue to communicate with you throughout the webinar on how this might work. If you have questions, please send them to us via the chat function, and we'll be able to troubleshoot anything that is going on. So let me pass it now to Casey to continue the presentation.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So thank you, everyone, for attending. So just a quick bit about this project. The Local Housing Trust Fund Manual for Minnesota was part of a cross-departmental collaboration within MHP. It involved folks from our capacity building and technical assistance department, our research and communications department, and our policy and advocacy department to create this tool. So today, we're primarily going to focus on what is a local housing trust fund and why would you want to use it. We'll briefly touch on parts of the manual that will go over some of the more detailed things like how to establish one and how to operate one. Instead of digging into those in detail, we'll tell you kind of what's in the manual about those topics. And then later, our wonderful guest speakers will be able to give you some examples from Saint Paul and Alexandria. So jumping in, probably the first question is, what is a local housing trust fund? Well, it's established by elected government bodies at the city, county, or even state level, and you can also have multiple jurisdiction house funds that are established, housing trust funds that are established through a joint powers authority, so those can cover multiple jurisdictions. And what they do is they dedicate public revenues to a distinct fund that is used to address housing needs. So I kind of like to think of it as a savings account for housing projects. A little while ago, the state of Minnesota passed the statute 462C.16, and what this did was present sort of a guideline on what could be incorporated into a housing trust fund, what are some of the things that you could use it for, and it's a really great starting place to know if you're interested in starting a housing trust fund, sort of what the state considers a housing trust fund to be. So that's a great place to get started. So why would you want to start a housing trust fund? Well, all across the state of Minnesota, we've seen housing shortages in both the metropolitan and rural areas. We've seen an increase in the number of cost-burdened households. And as, in particularly for aging housing stock that, maybe folks can't upkeep it quite as well, we're seeing an increase in substandard housing units. So these are kind of some broad statewide issues in housing needs that a local housing trust fund can help to address. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Elizabeth to walk us through some of the more specific benefits of the housing trust fund.
Thanks, Casey. So Casey has kind of walked you through what might be some of the needs information that you're looking at in your community, but the big question ends up being, why would you want a local housing trust fund for your community? What are the benefits to your community of using this particular technique to fund and prioritize affordable homes and housing needs as opposed to some other mechanism? So we wanted to run through a few of the benefits to help you with why local housing trust funds can provide some benefit to your community. So first, Casey has mentioned this savings account approach, which is really one of, I think, the hallmarks of a local housing trust fund, is that you have funds that are dedicated to housing and can't be used for other purposes. We know that it's a challenge for local governments to be able to balance often competing interests, and having dedicated funds where the political decision has been made that we need to prioritize housing helps ensure that those funds remain for that purpose. Another feature of dedicated funding and a best practice that we are recommending is that the funds in a local housing trust fund are recurring funds. The reason this is helpful is that you are not then having to make year-to-year political decisions, but rather have that be a decision, that political discussion, when the fund is proposed and the contours of the fund are established. And of course, different decisions can be made at any point in time on how to dedicate those funds or how to utilize those funds. I will say we've gotten a little bit of feedback that we've had a bit of an echo, and we've been troubleshooting on that, so I just wanted to mention that. I hope everyone is able to hear the presentation. Let us know if there's any problems that you're having. A second benefit is that local housing trust funds are reliable and predictable. It is hard to find a housing need that does not often take multiple years to determine how to go from concept to reality. So being able to have funds that are dedicated to housing, again, different than a one-time program decision, creates reliability for community, for developers or others that are working on specific housing projects, and helps to ensure that you're able to have a multiple year impact and take a long-term planning approach. There's been a lot of documentation on how local housing trust funds can leverage additional public and private funds and general economic benefit to your community. One figure that is used, that's a nationwide figure, is for every dollar in a trust fund, it can leverage 6 additional dollars. But I know that depending on the local housing trust fund, we've seen those leverage amounts be even bigger. Another feature of the leveraging that I'd like to mention is that having a local housing trust fund can also leverage your competitiveness to participate in other funding programs for housing. it can be a tremendous benefit to an application you make, for example, to Minnesota Housing, to be able to show that your local government has made a substantial commitment to housing. And then local housing trust funds, another hallmark is that these are flexible funds, that they are able to be used and defined as your community sees fit. This is your community making those local control decisions. Finally, local housing trust funds are just establishing the local housing trust fund is a significant way to ensure that community and others in the outside world are able to understand housing is a priority for your local community, and you are making a statement to that effect with your local housing trust fund and what it prioritizes programmatically. This is a quote from Randall Hemmerland, who I have to say is one of our biggest promoters of local housing trust funds in the state of Minnesota because of the benefit that local housing trust fund has brought to his community of Red Wing, local control for a local issue. I'm turning it back to Casey.
Great. So housing trust funds are not actually particularly rare. You can find them in 49 states across the nation. And I believe we got this data last year, and they were able to leverage over $2 billion. And all of these housing trust funds can either be found in cities or counties, at the state level, or on a multi-county basis, which, you know, our southern neighbor here, Iowa, is a great example of that. Nearly the entire state is covered by a housing trust fund, and most of those are in multi-county trust funds. So this is a tool that can be used in both metropolitan areas, it can be used in rural areas, and it can be used on a variety of jurisdictional levels. So now we're going to shift gears a tiny bit and quickly cover some of the topics that are inside the Local Housing Trust Fund Manual for Minnesota. So in addition to sort of the benefits of the Housing Trust Fund that we just talked about, the manual will also guide you through some of the considerations that you as a community will need to take in terms of establishing a housing trust fund and operating housing trust fund. So the next couple of slides are just examples of some of those questions and topics that you would need to consider. So defining your community's goals and finding the data that you need to understand what your housing needs are, identifying the right funding sources for your housing trust fund, selecting an administrator. Will it be a government agency? Will it be a nonprofit? And what is the oversight involved in those decisions? And then on the operations side, there's a variety of projects and programs that the Housing Trust Fund can support. And these are some of the examples here on screen, from grants and loans to home buyer counseling services. So this will really be informed by how you define your community's needs as well. You might choose to do some demographic or geographic targeting with your housing trust fund. So some trust funds in their community, they have a need for senior housing. So their trust fund is geared towards providing that. Or maybe they want more housing near transit corridors, so the Housing Trust Fund is set up in a way to support housing there. So again, other questions on how you might be able to use your Housing Trust Fund. How you distribute the funds is another question to consider. Do you want to set up a competitive application process? Do you have existing programs that you can channel the funds through? So those are all kind of considerations that will need to be taken in the process of setting up a housing trust fund, and those are some of the topics that are covered in the Local Housing Trust Fund Manual. And with this next slide, as I turn it over to Elizabeth, you can see that there's a number of Minnesota jurisdictions that have adopted a housing trust fund or are considering one.
Thanks, Casey. Yes, we have continued to have interest, and I will say a lot of what we're hearing is anecdotal. There certainly may be broader interest and work happening across the state than we are aware of, but we are getting a lot of inquiries from counties, from cities, from HRAs about how to establish local housing trust funds. One community that's not on the list, but is right now going through the process to establish a local housing trust fund and propose it as a mechanism to benefit housing is Crow Wing HRA, which is working with Crow Wing County on that proposal. I might just highlight one example from this list, and that is Goodhue County. And I wanted to pick out Goodhue County in part because it's a county, and often we talk about cities and local housing trust funds, but this is actually something that we've had a lot of interest from counties on. In Goodhue County, the HRA recommended to Goodhue County that a local housing trust fund could be a beneficial way to prioritize housing. And the decision makers there said, yes, that does sound like a good idea. They are levying approximately $100,000 every year for a variety of purposes, including what they call a workforce assistance program, which is really targeting down payment assistance, a multifamily housing project fund, and a flexible fund that can be used for existing categories when needed. So that shows how you can use funds that really fit what is the capacity of your community and still make a tremendous difference in the housing needs for your community. We wanted to make sure we shared with you some additional resources. The Center for Community Change has a Housing Trust Fund project, which is really the national go-to place for information on housing trust funds across the county, whether they be state-level housing trust funds or city or county level trust funds, and they have a variety of reports and other great information that you may want to check out. And then Enterprise Community Partners also has some helpful resource that we've linked to there, in addition to some of the resources we have at the Minnesota Housing Partnership. And here is contact information for myself and for Casey, so that you can feel free to contact us about any of your questions after this webinar presentation. And I'll just say again, we are getting a variety of contacts from communities that are looking for assistance and connection as they work through their process on how can a local housing trust fund serve the needs in their community. So let me turn it now back to Casey to introduce our first guest speaker.
Okay, so I have the honor of introducing Kayla Shookman, who is the Housing Director of the City of Saint Paul Planning and Economic Development Department. So prior to her role in Saint Paul, Kayla was a project manager for Common Bond Communities, helping to compose multifamily deals for development there. And she also spent 9 years at Minnesota Housing implementing affordable housing policy. Kayla serves on the board of the nonprofit Urban Homeworks and also on the Family Housing Fund. And right before I turn it over to you, Kayla, I just want to remind everyone that you can utilize the Q&A function in your webinar screen. And if you have any questions so far, feel free to submit them, and we'll be keeping a tally on those to cover those at the end. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you, Kayla.
All right, well, thank you, Casey, and thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me to speak about our Housing Trust Fund in St. Paul. Really excited to have the pleasure to talk to you all. The city had a local housing trust fund years back in the early 2000s, but we have a newly funded housing trust fund established in 2019 for the first time with really significant local resources. So I wanted to cover on the next slide just an outline of the conversation today. I wanted to talk a little bit about the process for creating our housing trust fund here in St. Paul. why we chose to establish a local housing trust fund, and then to give you a little context for what our housing trust fund strategy is and how we got to that through a look at some data on housing needs in St. Paul. Next slide, please. So in terms of process for creating the Housing Trust Fund, in St. Paul here, the mayor proposed the Housing Trust Fund and organized support with the council and community, and really served as the champion for driving forward the Housing Trust Fund. The mayor and the council were really well aligned on the need to make a bold investment in housing, and so it was really a sort of policymaker level drive to create this resource. Staff's role in this process really was to help identify what some possible funding mechanisms could be. We knew we had a resource here in the city that could be really powerful in capitalizing a housing trust fund, either through sale of one of our downtown parking ramps or through sort of a refinancing. And then our other role in sort of the process of organizing support was really to help inform the mayor and the council on how we could use the funds and what the impact of the bold investment that they were proposing could be in terms of meeting the housing needs of our community. Next slide, please. So why the Local Housing Trust Fund? Our mayor and council really recognized that housing was a priority. The community was really rallying behind housing as a priority, and as the needs were growing and have continued to grow, everyone here really recognized that to meet a growing need would require growing resources. From a staff level perspective, we were really interested in a tool that would be flexible, that would allow us to meet multiple needs, on both the single family and multifamily side, that would allow us to try some innovative things. We, of course, value and need our federal resources, but we know that these resources don't go far enough, and they come with certain restrictions that make some uses more difficult. So we were really excited about the opportunity to have a resource that we could really be creative with. So the mayor's 2019 budget proposal included a one-time $10 million infusion into our Housing Trust Fund and a $2 million ongoing investment. So what we're talking about in terms of size for St. Paul is over the next 3 years, an additional $16 million being invested into housing needs in St. Paul. So this is really significant new local flexible dollars that, combined with our federal resources, brings our budget for the next 3 years to $71 million invested in housing. So really thrilled and excited to have the opportunity to really create a housing strategy that is responsive to the needs. Next slide, please. So I wanted to shift into how we're using our Housing Trust Fund, but before I get there, I really wanted to provide a little context for the housing needs in St. Paul. Our strategy for our Housing Trust Fund is really grounded in data and community voice. We really want to, with this resource that is being invested, we really want to make sure that we are prioritizing our Housing Trust Fund on a strategy that is both data and community driven. So in terms of the data, a little context, St. Paul recently became a majority renter city. With the foreclosure crisis and a younger city, we've had the number of renters over the past decade or so increase 12%. This trend has been especially dramatic for people of color in our city. We currently are at somewhere around 80% in particular of African American households renting in our city. So we really, this has been really informative in how we have set our Housing Trust Fund strategy. At the same time, we have more folks renting. Rents have increased significantly in St. Paul over the past decade or so. Rents have increased about 15%, while incomes, everywhere have not been keeping pace with that. We now have 50% of renters in our city are cost burden, paying more than 30% of their income towards rent, and this is really important, sort of widespread impacts in a community when families have less money to spend on other needs, whether that's food or health care or investments that they want to make in kids' education. So this has really been compounded by, sorry, next slide, please. A really strong rental market. Landlords have been increasingly selective. We have vouchers harder to place in our community. We have people with lower incomes, no credit, or with criminal backgrounds finding it increasingly difficult to find affordable housing. And at the same time, the supply of what is considered affordable has been dwindling. So as we continue to add to the supply, we also continue to lose some of the stock of housing that has traditionally served a large number of our low and moderate income households in what we call NOAH housing, so naturally occurring affordable housing. Smaller Class C properties make up a large percentage of the housing stock here in St. Paul and have historically been relatively affordable here in our community. So as the rental market has heated up, that has started to change, and investors have been really interested in these properties, and we've seen more sales of these properties with rents being increased. With the same pressure really being seen in our market for subsidized housing as well. Next slide, please. So this slide is showing up a little bit awkwardly here for some reason, but basically the result of all of this is that it's harder for St. Paul residents to find housing that is affordable, and this has become such a significant need in our community that our policymakers this year made a very bold commitment to meeting these needs. And our strategy is grounded in that context. Next slide, please. On the homeownership side, we continue to have, in Minnesota, but in St. Paul being no different, we have a large homeownership gap between households of color and white households. And this is something that has been important to us as we've considered our Housing Trust Fund, because we know that for many Americans, homeownership is one of the primary ways that folks build wealth. Average homeowner net worth being almost $200,000 compared to just over $5,000 of average net worth for renters. So this has been an important sort of grounding context data point for us as well in our strategy. Next slide, please. So we've created a strategy that we've presented to our policymakers that's really focused both on production of new units, preservation of the both subsidized and naturally occurring stock that makes up our existing housing, and really a conversation around renter protection in St. Paul and how we decrease barriers to the housing that we do have here. Next slide, please. So the strategy for our Housing Trust Fund, again, we're having a little formatting issues here, but the housing strategy that will guide the $16 million we have for the next 3 years is laid out on this slide. But I do want to point out that one of the key benefits of the Housing Trust Fund from staff perspective is that it is such a flexible tool that we can use to continue to respond to evolving housing needs in our community. And so the strategy that we have arrived at now is guiding our next 3 years, but we'll continue to see this strategy as a living, breathing seeing that as housing needs change, we have now a tool that's flexible and we can real-time respond to changing housing needs with a changing strategy. So one of our key priorities is really to deepen the affordability of the investments that we're making in the housing supply. We've done a really great job of creating units at 60% AMI here in St. Paul, and that's a key part of our housing need. But with the Housing Trust Fund, we now have an opportunity to create more deeply affordable housing opportunities. So that's a key priority for us. Preservation, Objective 2, is really important part of our strategy here. And as I've alluded to a couple of times, innovation. We really have the opportunity that sometimes is a little more challenging with with federal dollars. We have the opportunity now to try some things and pilot some things and see how they work and use that to inform our work going forward. And so we're really focused on being innovative with our Housing Trust Fund. Objective 4 for the city, we are interested in moving the needle both in terms of responding to what is a crisis in the current market, but also moving the needle long-term for households. So how do we invest in housing with our trust fund in a way that meets those immediate needs, but also moves the needle in terms of wealth creation for families long-term? And we're also focused on fair housing and tenant protections as a part of our housing strategy. So with the 2019 budget that was adopted in January, we have the resources now set aside, and we've been busy really engaging the community, our council, and mayor on arriving at this strategy and starting to really develop and launch programs that are funded out of this. So this spring we launched 4D property tax incentive for market rate naturally occurring affordable housing properties. We launched a community land trust pilot and are currently working on a down payment assistance program, both of which we plan to leverage through Minnesota Housing's Impact Fund to nearly double the size of those programs. We're also working on launching this school year something that I think would have been really challenging to do, both in terms of the size of our federal resources, but also the restrictions, challenging to impossible. We're working on a rent assistance program right now that we're calling our Rent Supplement Pilot. And this is really a partnership with our school district that will leverage private philanthropic dollars. So really hits on a couple of the points that I think Elizabeth raised: leverage and flexibility. So we're really excited, and we're really busy getting our Housing Trust Fund up and running. So I will stop there.
Hang on just a moment here.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kayla. This is Elizabeth again. It was great to hear some of the St. Paul story and how you're really tailoring your local housing trust fund to meet St. Paul's desire for innovation and greater affordability and other unique ways that St. Paul wants to use its local housing trust fund. So now we're going to turn to our second guest speaker, Jeff Hess, who is the Executive Director of the Alexandria HRA. Jeff has been in his role for 15 years, so providing leadership to Alexandria for a significant amount of time. So I'm really interested to see how he came upon local housing trust funds as something that he felt fit the needs of the community, or how exactly that happened. Jeff also has been highly engaged with Minnesota NARO, including serving 2 terms as a board member for that organization. And Jeff, if you're there, we're ready to hear about the Alexandria story.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, I'd like to thank the folks from MHP for putting this on today. It's a pretty interesting, flexible tool for communities to take advantage of, so I'm certainly excited to help out where I can. Before we get into my slides, because I really only have a couple of them, I just kind of wanted to talk about, you know, why a housing trust fund and where the idea came from. Kudos to Randall down in Red Wing. Randall had shared the story of the creation and implementation of their housing trust fund probably 3 years ago, and kind of just let the ball sit there for a while, and then about 18 months ago, locally we picked it up and started to pursue it. The reason why is that the HRA locally administers some housing-related programs. We do gap financing for new home construction. We do down payment assistance for acquisition. We do ongoing and emergency rehab. And I saw the Housing Trust Fund as a way to, number one, create some leverage for, you know, state or federal programs, and then number two, to embolden or to grow the programs that the HRA is already administering. This is the City of Alexandria's trust fund, and it is administered by the HRA. So, you know, we are partnering with the city to bring this to the table. Our creation has been a team effort between city staff, the council, the mayor, and economic development staff. Those entities working together on this for 16 to 18 months. We finally, I think, had our second reading in July. So we are just getting into the implementation phase right now. So I just wanted to take you folks through our steps that we went through in the creation, maybe a lesson or two that was learned, and maybe just talk a little bit about the funding at the tail end. But how this came to be in Alexandria is, again, you know, Randall had shared the information with me some time ago. I did a little research into state statute, and I brought it to the HRA board, presented it to the commissioners, and they were excited and asked me to proceed in working with city staff, which I did. I met with city and EDA staff, you know, 2, 3, 4 times over the course of a few months. There was some excitement there because of the flexibility that a housing trust fund brings to the table. And as Kayla had said, as needs change in your community, your trust fund is already in place, and you can just target funds towards those needs. The HRA, the city, and the EDA staff went ahead and presented this concept to the city's budget committee, and our budget committee is made up of the city administrator, the mayor, and another council member, and they seem to be very interested in it. And a couple months later, we had our first reading for the city ordinance, and it, quite frankly, died in the water. And I say, Jeff goes home with his head between his knees, which is a little bit how I felt, because I thought we had this great idea, this great concept, but like I said, it died on the table. And what I learned in that process, and I think what we all learned, is we thought we were being thorough in presenting our information to some of our stakeholders, mainly the council. And this was a new concept, and you know, anytime you adapt early technology, there are some unforeseen consequences, and what our unforeseen consequence was is we could not communicate enough with our council to make sure they felt comfortable with this concept. So we let the ball sit for a couple months, picked it back up, and the next, on the right side of the slide that you have in front of you, you know, we just went through various committees, meeting with them multiple times at the city level, and presenting a unified front in terms of city staff, EDA staff, and HRA staff. And when we felt like everybody really had a good feel for it and was comfortable with it, then it was brought back for its first reading, and then a couple weeks later brought back for its second reading in July. And it passed unanimous. It was a matter of making sure people were comfortable with the concept and really understood it. So if you go to the next slide, it kind of, we'll talk a little bit about what our priorities are. And we included our priorities as part of the ordinance. Single-family home construction and acquisition, this can be accomplished either through affordability gap financing or value gap financing. We anticipate down payment assistance and assistance with closing costs to be utilized quite a bit. And we want to focus on single-family rehabilitation, but we also want to focus on, there's a high number of properties in town that are single-family rental. And we've had a tough time identifying a program that can assist those units that are scattered so far throughout the community. So we're hoping to be able to assist some of those units as well. Right now, the main funding for our trust fund comes from the city's revolving loan fund, partially from the HRA levy, and also from tax increment financing districts. So this year we've identified about $300,000, and we've probably identified a real similar amount for the following year. So I've heard one person say, I think it's the city planner that often says, you know, this is just another tool in our toolbox. With $300,000 a year, we're not going to solve all of the affordability problems in Alexandria, but it's another tool that could, you know, help out a number of people. And I think when you take the long view and you look at this 10, 15, or 20 years down the road, you can make a pretty significant impact, or at least we hope that we can. So that is about all I have. I'll push it back to the MHP folks.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and I really appreciate that you shared not just all the bells and whistles, everything is a great story, but that sometimes it's a road that you need to take to kind of figure out how to get at a solution, and that interplay of community, elected officials, and staff in arriving at what's the right articulation of a tool to benefit housing, and how does local housing trust funds fit into that. I am going to turn it over to Casey to kind of throw out a first question. And in the meantime, just want to remind folks who are participating in the webinar that they can use the Q&A function, or if you're having trouble finding that, the chat function, to throw out a question that we can have our guest presenters or Casey or myself answer as appropriate. So Casey.
All right. So the first question we have, and it's a little bit of a two-parter, is what is the next step for your local housing trust fund? And the second part is, at what point do you see an appropriate way for the community to get involved in the housing trust fund? So Kayla, would you feel free to answer first?
Yeah, sure. So I would just start with the community input aspect of your question. This is something that I think is really, really key to how you design your strategy, to make sure that it's meeting the right needs. Because as Jeff said, our investment right now is a really, really key, important investment, but we know it won't meet all of the needs in our city. And so having community conversations to prioritize which needs you meet, I think is a really important step. So we've had a seat at many tables to make sure that we are hearing from community on housing needs. You know, some of these tables are specifically conversations around our housing trust fund, but a lot of them are just, you know, showing up where community will be talking about housing needs. Because folks, you know, a lot of times don't talk about specific policy recommendations, but they talk about their experiences or the experience of their neighbors or their family. And so, you know, just being present at neighborhood meetings, you know, other sort of events where folks are talking about housing needs has been really important to framing our housing trust fund strategy. And then, you know, as we've started to develop an actual strategy, continuing to sit down with community groups and advocates to share what our current thinking is, and then bringing that back in front of our policymakers in a public forum, I think has been really important. So in terms of next steps for us, we're really in the implementation phase. So we've got a strategy that we're working under that we've presented to our council members and mayor, and we're really trying to implement programs in a timely manner so that we're leveraging dollars as quickly as possible, and so that we're getting dollars out in the community as quickly as we can, because we know that housing needs are really acute right now. So we've been implementing programs the last 6 months, and we're still in that phase. We're carving out, dollars from our Housing Trust Fund to go towards specific needs. I think that the next 2 that will roll out for us will be our rent supplement pilot, the partnership with our public school district, and our down payment assistance program.
Thank you. Jeff?
Yeah, okay, so to, probably answer the question the same order Kayla did. I think in terms of community involvement, I would really encourage people to get in touch with their local elected officials. I've heard from a number of council members that they really want to see this program utilize the Housing Trust Fund, and the more information they hear from their constituents about it, I think will help in future allocations to the Housing Trust Fund, and of course to talk to city staff as well. Where we are at in the implementation process is we are currently reworking our HRA program documents to fit Housing Trust Fund, because the HRA has done these programs internally for years, but now they're going to be coming from the Housing Trust Fund. The other thing that we're doing is with a couple of our programs, we're working with local lenders to make some changes so that they're better utilized, or at least that we hope that they're better utilized. I would say we're probably anywhere from 3 to 4 months away from our first distribution.
Thank you. This is Elizabeth. I'm just going to turn to a few questions right now that we've been getting from audience members. Some of them I think won't take very long to address, and then others might kind of go back to getting some broader input. One question we had was, where is MHP bringing this presentation? And so we are right now looking for requests to bring the presentation out to different groups. We are reaching out to the Association of Minnesota Counties. That was one of the questions. We are on the schedule for the Minnesota NARO conference, so we'll be able to present there. And we're not scheduled for anything right now with the League of Minnesota Cities, but I just wanted to call them out because they've been a really great partner in helping us spread the word to local communities about this tool. A second question to deal with is what restrictions in Minnesota law are there on housing trust funds? And I wanted to answer this in a couple different ways. One is that you can find Minnesota law at it's section 462C.16. We have the ordinance, or excuse me, not the ordinance. The state law is it's an attachment to our local housing trust fund manual, and so you should read that through. The state law is really identifying what you need to do to be able to leverage what is probably a potential match for a local housing trust fund. In most of the articulation in the state law allows for very broad use of a local housing trust fund, but the uses are about, again, producing and supporting housing, such as with down payment assistance, rental assistance is a permitted use, grants, loans, and other ways to support the development, rehabilitation, and financing of housing. So I would encourage folks to read that state law themselves, And then we discussed it at great length in our local housing trust fund manual. There was a question specific to St. Paul. I don't know, Casey, if you can read my writing, why don't you pose that one to Kayla?
Okay. Let's see here.
The question was, can you say a little bit more, Kayla, about how St. Paul is using the 4D program and whether or not St. Paul has adopted an ordinance?
Sure. So the 4D program that we launched this spring or late winter was really a recognition that we have this stock of housing in St. Paul that is really serving many of our low and moderate income residents at affordable rental rates, similar to subsidized housing, but that's not receiving the tax benefit that subsidized housing projects receive through state law on the low income rental classification, or 4D. So 4D in state statute allows properties that receive affordable housing dollars and have an affordable housing restriction recorded against the property to be eligible for a 40% reduction in the property tax rate that they pay, which is a significant, recognition of the cost of reducing rents on a property. And so what we did was launch a 4D program for naturally occurring affordable housing in St. Paul for owners that are serving low and moderate income residents that were willing to commit to keeping rents affordable for the next 10 years to be eligible to receive funding and a funding award from St. Paul and become eligible for the 4D tax rate. So we received a huge response from property owners. We, had the advantage of really the program that Minneapolis launched in advance of our program. I think they launched last year or maybe the year before. And we designed our program very similarly. With one exception, we prioritized property owners that agreed to restrict rents at 50% of area median income. So we ended up funding and making eligible for 4D tax status about 420 rental units, and about half of those agreed to keep units at 50% of area median income. So that was our program, and the cost of that program, was very efficient in terms of upfront dollars. Obviously, there's a cost to the property tax reduction, but a really, really efficient way to leverage a lot of units.
Thank you, Kayla. And then just more briefly, has St. Paul adopted an ordinance or not?
For related to 4D?
No,
or unrelated?
Local housing trust funds.
Oh, gotcha. So St. Paul has not adopted an ordinance. The money was included in the mayor's budget and adopted by the council this year.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks so much, Kayla. So Jeff, we think this question might be up your alley a little bit. How would this effort differ from or potentially interact with a community development corporation?
It's a dark alley. I don't know how much it would differ from, but I think we're looking at it as right now, the city doesn't really have a vehicle for, say, a local nonprofit developer to come in and access funds. And this will allow them to do that. And we do have a local nonprofit developer that does some new home construction development in our area as well as adjoining areas. And now they will be able to benefit from these dollars rather than, maybe making application to a state or federal agency.
We have about 4 minutes left, and so I wonder if I can ask this last question, which came from an audience member, and maybe a a little bit of a speed response from Jeff and Kayla. We'll see how we do. But the question is, can the Housing Trust Fund investments that your community has made also increase the value of other community assets? And I think that's a question that kind of goes to why did you do this in the first place, but maybe starting with you, Jeff, what's your reaction to that question?
That's a really interesting question, and if I understand, how it's being presented, I think, kind of all boats lift or go down together. And if we improve the housing stock in our community, that's going to have an overall improvement to the community overwide.
Kayla, we've got 2 minutes left.
I would absolutely agree with Jeff. I mean, I think from my perspective, there's really two ways that our investments will, I think, increase the value of other community assets. And that's, first, just the infusion of capital investments into the housing stock in St. Paul improves the condition of the property that's there. I mean, I think our developers, our partners do really good work at creating quality, affordable housing that really benefits communities and is, in some cases, much nicer quality than some of the market rate housing that exists. So just in terms of that physical investment, I think, there's a tangible benefit to community. The other benefit, I think, is that, housing really is sort of that platform for families. And so more stable housing leads to, kids doing better in schools, people being able to hold down jobs or get better jobs. And so we really see housing as a key investment that will have other community payoffs.
Thank you so much. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to Kayla and Jeff for sharing the stories of St. Paul and Alexandria's Housing Trust Funds. We just want to leave with a quick save the date. So next time, our second part in this webinar series, we'll dig into a little bit more of the how to operate and how to establish a local housing trust fund. So digging into those details a little bit more, and we have that scheduled for September 20th. We'll also have some resources from this webinar and more information about the upcoming webinars on our website at mhponline.org. And so if we weren't able to get to all of your questions today, feel free to reach out. Elizabeth and I have our contact information on the MHP website, and we would certainly welcome to hear your feedback and questions. So with that, we'll end the webinar and we'll say thank you so much for joining us.